Okay, good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome to this webinar. I'm Vivian Russell. I'm the Head of Communications and Content at CIPFA, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So we've called this webinar Local Government in the Age of COVID-19, How to Deal with Short-Term Cash Crises. And I can't really think of anything kind of more topical for a CIPFA audience, really. It's a really timely moment to be having this discussion on the financial impact being borne by local authorities because of this pandemic. We know, it's really beginning to attract some serious media attention. Just this weekend, you may have seen the story in the Times on the Saturday, which focused on the risks to councils' income from investments in commercial property and what's happening there. And of course, we know that all these risks to income are happening against a backdrop of an extraordinary rise in demand on councils. So to discuss these questions with us, we've got a fantastic panel of speakers for you. I'm delighted to welcome Carolyn Williamson, who is Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Resources at Hampshire County Council. And of course, Carolyn's currently CIPFA President. We have Sarah Pickup, who is Deputy Chief Executive of the Local Government Association. And we also have Andrew Burns, who is Associate Director for Local Government here at CIPFA, formerly of Staffordshire County Council, I'm sure you know, and of course, also a former CIPFA President himself. Before I hand over to Carolyn, who's our first speaker, just want to say that we do want this to be an interactive event, so you do have an opportunity to put your questions forward to our panel. You should all have a little sort of dashboard in front of you with a question box, so please do type your questions into there, and I'll pick those up and I can put those to the speakers after the presentations. We've allowed about an hour for this webinar. We'll hope to have about sort of 10 or 15 minutes for questions and discussion towards the end, and we'll try and wrap up promptly at midday. So without further ado, I am going to hand on to our first speaker, who's Carolyn Williamson, who's Deputy CEO and Director of Corporate Resources at Hampshire County Council and CIPFA President. Carolyn, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, colleagues. Welcome to this event. As we all know, 10 years of austerity have taken a heavy toll across the public sector, but it's an indisputable fact that the brunt of that toll landed squarely on the local authority sector. The impact of austerity encompassed significant cuts to government funding, coupled with a halt to increases in government grant to reflect inflation and demand pressures. This is the additional hidden cut, as many tend to forget that our annual government funding was historically increased to partially reflect these factors. We also had 5 years of council tax freezes for many councils who heeded the government's request to freeze council tax in return for a recurring 2% freeze grant. Politicians promised that the freeze grant would not be cut. Well, as we all know, that grant was removed from our funding as well. During this period, we have benefited from some demand growth, particularly across adults and children's, but always as a one-off, never enough to avoid making additional savings to fund demand, and never with any certainty for the future. Obviously, our hopes for the Fair Funding Review, business rate retention and spending review processes were to resolve all of this and allow us to get to a position of clarity from government regarding service expectations underwritten by appropriate funding to deliver those services, with a clear expectation of multi-year announcements updated on a rolling basis. A move to rolling 3 or 4 year funding certainty. Not a lot to ask, really. But first we had Brexit, and now we have COVID, and they have put a halt to the process, leaving us with 1 year funding, sticking plasters, and now significant uncertainty regarding the government's commitment to fully fund local government for the financial consequences of COVID. So where are we on the government's commitment? We started out well, didn't we? Early on in the crisis, government ministers made various commitments to local government. We will do whatever it takes, Rishi Sunak, Chancellor of the Exchequer. Spend what you need to spend and we will reimburse you, Robert Jenrick, Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. More recently, there have been statements around local government sharing the burden with government, which are in stark contrast to what had gone before. But since last week, when Communities Secretary faced a grilling from MPs, the mood music has drastically changed again. He said he would fully fund all costs for the additional COVID-19 related services we have been asked to take on, but no more. Jenrick stated that we should not labour under the false impression that all of our costs will be covered. As councils address the stark reality of funding the pandemic and the government's new mantra that the £3.2 billion emergency funding is enough, we are obviously in a standoff over cash with the Secretary of State. The shift in tone from central government has angered our council leaders. After a decade of austerity, local authorities are already cash-strapped, and now we face fighting an emergency on an already inadequate funding position from government, and with huge amounts of financial uncertainty regarding our necessary response to COVID. The direct costs of COVID are just a fraction of the financial issues faced by local government. There will clearly be a long-term economic and social costs impact on communities, alongside a dramatic drop in income and the abrupt halt in transformation programmes that were due to save the council's cash. So far, the emergency cash has allowed Section 151 officers to hold off on Section 114 notices, but the government's new tone will make us more anxious, as we have a sense that our finances will not be supported, pushing us closer to having to call a halt to spending. COVID has very publicly exposed what Section 151s and their chief executives and councils up and down the country have known for some time. Local government as a whole requires a larger quantum of funding in order to achieve sustainability in the medium to long term. Government thinking that they can abdicate responsibility for the full financial consequences of COVID and expect local authorities to deal with certain aspects is clearly flawed. Local government has no tax raising powers beyond council tax, which is restricted by the government, and is also likely to reduce as a result of the crisis and the reduced earning capacity of residents. Government, on the other hand, can borrow to support revenue spend and can increase taxes to raise revenue across a number of different areas. So, what has the government done to ensure that early commitment to underwriting COVID financial consequences? Government support to local authorities to assist with the response is mainly centred around the announcement on the 19th of March of 1.6 million grant funding, with the distribution on a relative needs basis linked partially to adult social care. And then on 18th April, a second announcement was made, allocating a further 1.6 billion to local government. This final allocation to individual authorities was not released until 28th of April due to changes to distribution methodologies to be used, which saw a move away from relative needs to one based more on population, and in two-tier areas this was split 35% to districts and 65% to counties. Whilst the local government sector fully supports the need to allocate funding to districts to offset their substantial income losses, it is unfortunate that this has been at the expense of mostly county and metropolitan councils, whose needs most certainly have not reduced at this time. A better alternative would have been to provide an additional and separate funding stream to address the income losses across the whole sector. That could have been allocated on a more appropriate basis. The current methodology of moving money away from social care providers when this is highlighted as one of the biggest areas of needs seems nonsensical at this stage. It feels a bit like robbing Peter to pay Paul, rather than recognising the full financial implications. Local government as a sector are standing strongly together to make the case to government across the 5 financial categories, which evidences the financial consequences of COVID. Firstly, the direct response costs. Secondly, the need for market underwriting. Thirdly, the increased demand directly from COVID-19. Fourthly, losses of funding sources or income. And finally, other issues which include the impact on our savings programmes. MHCLG are gathering financial data regularly to assist them in collating the evidence regarding the financial consequences, and hopefully this will firstly build up trust that Section 151 officers are submitting valid claims for funding, and secondly confirming that as a sector local government will not maintain financial resilience without the continuation of the early commitment to fully underwrite those financial consequences. So, what is a Section 114 report? The Local Government Finance Act 1988 states that the Chief Financial Officer shall make a report if it appears that the expenditure of the authority incurred, including expenditure it proposes to incur in a financial year, is likely to exceed the resources, including sums borrowed, available to it to meet that expenditure. As we all know, councils are required to live within their means, and as Section 151 officers, we have a legal duty in that regard. Without such clarity regarding central government underwriting the financial consequences, we have already looked to halt all non-essential expenditure and are reviewing our capital programmes and other commitments. We have a duty to consider financial sustainability over the foreseeable future and not as and when councils simply hit short-term cash flow difficulties. As the responsible finance officers, we are concerned that government does not adequately understand this position and the real prospect of many councils, including a sizable number of counties, issuing Section 114 notices. Pre-COVID and post 10 years of austerity, all councils were very aware of the cliff edge. Northamptonshire arrived there first, but we would all have been indicating in our medium-term financial strategies and Section 25 reports, which accompany our budget reports, that without firm and sustainable levels of medium-term government funding, we were not financially resilient. What this means in simple terms is that we could all see the cliff edge, and without financial certainty over the medium term, we could not clearly determine how close we were, but knew we were getting there. COVID has significantly speeded up our potential arrival at the cliff edge, with a requirement to expend significantly above our budget with no absolute certainty of government underwriting. In anyone's Section 151 spreadsheet, this feels very close to a Section 114 report, as we do not have sufficient unallocated reserves to rely upon, nor do we have any obvious non-essential savings to be made. Indeed, part of the problem, as I said, is an inability to deliver planned savings because of COVID. So what does the government need to do to avoid Section 114 notices across local government? MHCLG needs to explicitly set out how it intends to address all of the financial consequences of COVID. This must address additional costs, loss of income through fees and charges, reduced council tax and business rate yield, the changing cost of care, the impact on capital programmes, and the inability to deliver planned savings in the current crisis. This is both essential and urgent if there is a collective wish to ensure that councils are able to deliver on government's expectations at best, and at worst to avoid some councils having to issue Section 114 notices, as is likely with the current short-term approach. Government needs to provide an underwriting agreement and/or set aside a fund perhaps which plans to take account of those consequences over this and coming years as the nation recovers, so that councils do not need to build such uncertainty into future budget setting projections. This approach would need to be factored into arrangements for 2021-22, but it cannot wait until the usual local government settlement timetable, or Section 151 officers will simply have to form their own views about future arrangements in the meantime. Such a commitment from government would reduce risk for councils, whilst ensuring that government does not fund any more than is genuinely required. For example, we are concerned regarding the future year's impact on council tax and business rates. The government's own CTB and NNDR financial returns will allow a clear audit trail and monitoring to ensure no council is better or worse off, and the right recompense is paid over at year end as part of the settlement. This proposed approach will avoid an unnecessary wave of Section 114 notices, which would be a complete distraction from fighting COVID. It would be a disaster to halt expenditure whilst fighting the COVID crisis. So when this is all over, the government must oversee an urgent, fundamental review of local government finances, at last putting local government on a sustainable footing. This may need to include consideration of local government reform, or indeed reform of the wider public sector. Colleagues, thank you. Thank
you very much, Carolyn. That was a very clear exposition of the state of play with some really quite very clear asks for central government. I'm now going to hand over to our second presenter, Sarah Pickup, who is Deputy Chief Executive of the Local Government Association. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. Oh, I've just clicked out of the webinar. How do I change the slide?
You should be able to click through. If not, I can do that for you.
Can you just, I've only got 2 slides. Could you go to the first one, please?
Sure.
The first non-title one. Thank you. Yeah, that's fine. I wanted to start here. So thanks to Carolyn for her kind of outline of the situation. And obviously quite a lot of what I would say is very much in accord with what she said. But I thought I'd start with what the April MHCLG returns told us. The LGA has an arrangement with MHCLG where they will share with us the returns. It was agreed slightly late in the day in April, so we've got some sort of summary figures only, but in May we will have the returns to use on the same basis the department used them, which we're very grateful for, and saves us collecting information twice from councils, which of course would not be very welcome. So the first slide shows you the projected cost pressures from the April returns, and we have to bear in mind that these were done very early in the COVID crisis. They necessarily, Section 151 officers had to make estimates of both the costs, pressures, and all the other things that they put on the form. Nevertheless, these were their genuine efforts to quantify how the pressures would hit them, and indeed how they would use their 1.6 billion. So on the cost side, you can see from this slide that the biggest cost pressure is adult social care. That's not surprising. A large part of the first cohort of money was actually calculated to cover the expected additional costs of adult social care, although it was obviously put out on a non-ring-fenced basis. I have to say that the two funding, neither was for a particular purpose. They were both to meet all the purposes which we come across, but of course all government departments think they can call on that money. And in the meantime, DHSC still tend to talk about it as if it was all for adult social care. So therein lies one of our problems. So this 3.2 billion sets out the key service pressures. And then if we go on to the other side, which gives us the income loss, you can see that as Carolyn said, exceeds the projected expenditure. So £7 billion of projected income losses. So 2/3 of the overall £10 billion pressure coming from lost income. And you can see how that breaks down, that the majority is from retained business rates and council tax, sales fees and charges coming along behind, and then other sources, including commercial income behind that. One of my reflections on this is that there's been a lot of discussion about how risky commercial investment is. No one ever said sales fees and charges was risky, did they? So when you're thinking about charging for your car parks and your leisure centres, you didn't think that was going to be a big risk, but here we are with that being bigger than the loss of commercial income. So starting from those figures then, what we've said at the LGA is that the current projections look as if we need, as a sector, 3 to 4 times more than the 3.2 billion which had been allocated in those first 2 tranches overall. And obviously that is based on those very early returns. We have in addition had liquidity measures of £6 billion, which obviously help with the immediacy of a fall in council tax revenues and things that when the grants had to be paid out early and so on. So we've had some support in that sense, but that of course only goes so far. The deferred payment of central share is only deferred. It will begin to be paid after 3 months, and so cash flow will start to arise again. There have been some other funding streams going through local government, so the business grants, the hardship funds, the rate reliefs, etc. And in addition, just recently, the care homes infection control fund, £600 million. The government has kind of tended to add that to the 3.2 and say it's now 3.8. In my book, it's a bit more like the business grants because it's got to go through to the care sector. Majority of it will be put out on a per bed basis. And so it's not in the same ballpark as the first 2 tranches of money that we had. The May returns to MHCLG are really important now because they give us the first full month's assessment of costs based on actuals in April, insofar as councils are able to do that. And as I understand it, there's a 99% response rate there, 2% greater than the last time. So nearly all councils are putting those responses in, recognising how important it is to get that data right. The LGA will have access to that data very shortly, and we will be, of course, analysing it as well. But not only that, we will be commissioning some independent work to project forward the impact of these pressures and income losses to the end of this year and into next. And that's partly because the impact, particularly of council tax and business rates, doesn't fall only in 1 year because of the way the collection funds work. And some of the pressures could fall into next year. Equally, it's because councils can't just wait till they've spent their last pound in order to decide to take action. They need to be thinking about whether they need to take action now, and also they need to be thinking about beginning the budget setting process for next year as they go through the summer and into the autumn. So the looking ahead bit will be really important. We have been doing a lot of work with the Treasurer Societies as well, with central government, to explain how local government finance works. You wouldn't think it would be necessary, but in particular, the budgetary responsibilities, the responsibilities of Section 151 officers, the need to make sure that not only the books balance today, but they will balance at the year end. And I think some of those messages are sinking in. They sink in faster in some places than others. But it's absolutely something that we need to continue to get across. We will continue, of course, to make the case for more resources, and it's absolutely clear that councils need certainty about how the issues that they are presented with will be addressed, even if that is not all through subsequent tranches of funding. What they need to know is what will happen. I think it's likely that in the end there'll be a kind of package of measures. And that's partly because things like council tax and business rates will probably need a different response, because some of the lost income will be deferred and hopefully be collected later, whereas for some of the other lost income, it's lost and gone and it's a one-off loss. So we may need some different solutions. And when we commission our independent work on the figures, we'll also be looking to see whether we can get suggestions about different ways that these solutions could come forward, which isn't to say we won't be thinking about that ourselves in the meantime and discussing with the Treasurer Societies and with MHCLG. So there could be multi-year solutions for council tax and business rates with some guarantee of a level of collection that would replicate previous years' collection levels. There could be something about balancing budgets over a multi-year period rather than in 1 year. There could be permission to capitalise some costs, and there could be permission to borrow for revenue. Of course, you don't need any of those latter things if the costs that you face are funded. So we need to be cautious about how we push those different aspects. In relation to a lot of the discussion in this seminar, the issue of Section 114 notices, for me, that's not where this starts. Section 114 notice is there when a council isn't intending to take the right action. So the first thing we need to look at is the extent to which councils will be taking budget monitoring reports to their cabinets and council meetings and proposing that additional measures will need to be taken in year to ensure a balanced budget at the year end, and perhaps even taking revised budget papers through to their meetings. I know I've spoken to some councils that are planning to do that. They think it's the right thing to do because they haven't got certainty that additional funding will follow. Of course, they're probably more hopeful on some aspects of the challenges they face than others, but nevertheless, they feel it's prudent to take some action now. Of course, that will affect services because you can't take spending out of your budget without some impact. And of course, the worry is that it will affect some of the things that councils have been doing to address the COVID crisis in their local areas. And that is particularly the case since the government, or the Secretary of State in particular, said that they will meet the costs of things they have asked councils to do, because of course there are many things that locally councils notice need doing which haven't necessarily been announced by the government. And at the outset of the crisis, I think councils were confident that those were things they should rightly be doing, and I think the government led us to believe that. So we will be looking to talk to councils about the extent to which people are proposing to take in-year budget measures as an assessment. I think it's a kind of assessment we should make before we get to the point of saying, okay, who's near a Section 114 report? No one wants to be there. And that's a measure for the Section 151 officer if their council are not doing the right thing. A lot will depend on confidence in government support, which is really critical. And at the moment, people are having to make assumptions about what they think the government will do. In a sense, the more the government says, whether one way or the other, in a reassuring way or not in a reassuring way, the assumptions change, don't they? And councils will have to think about what they need to do. I absolutely agree with Carolyn that we need to look forward beyond this to a sustainable future financing settlement for local government, a new way of financing, and we're starting to look at that at the LGA. I won't go into that today because it's not the purpose of the conversation. I look forward to answering some questions later. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Before I introduce our third speaker, I just want to send a reminder to the audience that this, we do want this to be an interactive event. We would like to receive your questions. So you don't have to wait to the end to submit a question. You can submit a question at any time. So please do take advantage of the box on the toolbar and send your question in. So our third and final speaker is Andrew Burns, who is Associate Director for Local Government at CIPFA, and of course a former CIPFA president himself. Andy, I am just going to give you control of the keyboard so you'll be able to navigate through your presentation. Andy, over to you.
Thank you, Viv. Thanks, Sarah and Carolyn. The problem of going third, of course, is particularly you're following such esteemed speakers as Carolyn and Sarah that all my best lines have been stolen, but quite a hard act to follow. So I'll probably talk around my slides rather than to my slides, and hopefully they'll provide a useful source of reference. I'm trying to move them through, and I don't appear to have. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the three things I wanted to just talk around were the challenges in balancing local authority budgets, a little bit about the role and responsibilities of the Chief Finance Officer, Section 151 officer, and talk a bit about CIPFA's guidance around that, and then some consideration of potential Section 114 notices, which I say have been mentioned by Carolyn and Sarah. I guess it's probably worth also pausing to think about. It's only what 10 or 11 weeks since sort of this started to have this fundamental impact on council finances. The Chancellor's budget on the 11th of March was still in sort of business as usual times. That was the week or so before the impact started to be material and 2 weeks before lockdown. And at that point, Rishi Sunak, as the new Chancellor, was talking about the levelling up agenda and climate change. And both those things have been crowded out of the current agenda, but we'll, I'm sure, come back to them. And it's amazing to think what councils have done in that period of time. The early considerations were about things like cash flow and getting support out to businesses and vulnerable communities. I'm trying to move my slides on and they are not working, so I wonder whether Viv or the team can move on to my next slide. Thank you. So the early days, there were issues about cash flow, getting support out to businesses with the new grants councils were putting in place, new governance and decision-making arrangements, key decisions, delegating things to the chief executive to get things done quickly and flexibly. Might be worth thinking about refreshing those and revisiting those to make sure they are still relevant. And then councils and council finance teams, if you like, being redeployed to support frontline service delivery in quite a remarkable way. So I think it's amazing to think how much has been achieved in a relatively short period of time. I think, building on a point that Sarah made, though, the understanding in government about the difference between cash flow and balancing the budget over the course of the full year, which of the income losses are temporary, which might be permanent, I don't think has been as well understood in government as I maybe hoped and expected. And CIPFA have had conversations a few times with MHCLG and Treasury and others about trying to remind people of the way that things work. So the challenges have been the additional costs from following government guidance, primarily in care, adults and children and homelessness, but also things like setting up additional mortuary capacity, for example, underwriting markets in social care, councils taking the lead in providing PPE for private care homes who have no local authority residents, but on the ground they're the best places to actually get support through. And I think councils have done a fantastic job in doing that. Hopefully those direct costs will be reimbursed, but I think it's in those other areas where there's less certainty and lack of confidence. The reduced income from sales, fees and charges and commercial activity, I'm not sure that was fully understood about the importance that was to fund local public services. I think nationally, about £12.7 billion of income is generated by local authorities to fund local services. And interesting to see that Sarah mentioned that there's 1.8 billion already shortfall on that already, but huge issue there. An important one that I think as people start to look forward will become even more into focus was the inability, not for the want of trying, of councils and delivering their efficiency savings and transformation savings programs that will be built into their budgets both for 2021 and beyond. Some of those will be in social care, which will not be deliverable ever. Some might be delayed, some might need to be rethought or revisited. And I think most councils would have had between 5 or 10% of their net budget supported by the need to make savings in the next year or two, rising to maybe 20% over 4 or 5 years. Most of that I don't think is going to be deliverable, and I think that's going to be a really important issue. And then finally, on council tax and business rates, both the impact on short-term collection, but also the longer-term tax base. Now, I think council tax, in the main, properties don't move, people live in them. There might be delays in being able to collect council tax in the short term. People find it harder to pay, but probably over time, I think most councils will get most council tax back. On business rates, we can't be that confident. How many businesses are going to survive at the end of this? And the business rates base might be a lot lower than it is at the start. So they're the things that councils are grappling with to try and balance the budget, both in the short and medium and then longer term. And as Sarah mentioned, that there's a data capture exercise going on from MHCLG, which Treasury Societies, the LGA, CIPFA have been involved in, and that's important for a couple of reasons. To help the lobbying case for more resources for Treasury. I mean, MHCLG need ammunition to go to Treasury to say, here are real additional costs being incurred by councils, here are real income losses. These need to be compensated because otherwise there's a devastating impact on local public services. And also at some point, from an accountability point of view, Parliament will want to know, the Public Accounts Committee will want to know what happened to the £3.2 billion that's been allocated to councils. So we'll need some sort of light touch assurance mechanism to think about that. So they are some of the challenges that councils have been dealing quite remarkably with, and CIPFA have been hearing lots of stories about amazing things going on. And I think the sector can be really proud of the way that local government has stepped up to the plate and dealt with these issues, arguably in a way which is much more coherent, consistent and comprehensive than some of the central government responses. Okay, on to my next slide, please. Oh gosh, it's going too fast now. Yeah, gain control. Okay, I'm not sure how many of the people on the webinar are Section 151 officers or Chief Finance Officers. I guess some will be, some won't be. There is a CIPFA statement on the role and responsibilities of a CFO, which we will send a link to with this following this webinar. And it outlines 5 principles for the role of a CFO, which are important all of the time, but I think are even more important at times of crisis. And that talks about the Chief Finance Officer being key member of the leadership team, being involved in the key financial and strategic decisions of the organisation, and being involved in the financial governance arrangements and ensuring good financial management of public money at all times. And I think in the initial responses about getting key decision-making arrangements more flexibly implemented I think that was a really important role that chief finance officers were playing, supporting their local resilience forums in order to do that, putting in place arrangements to capture the costs that are being incurred around COVID to make sure we can fully evidence them appropriately. Now, there's a balance between getting things done quickly in a crisis versus doing them properly to ensure public money is safeguarded, and that balance has rightly gone towards do it quickly rather than do it properly. But we're going to have to come back to doing it properly. We're going to have to come back to things like fraud risk, and we're going to have to make sure that, for example, internal audit work programs are amended significantly to ensure that we go back and have a look at fraud risks arising from the things we did very, very quickly, and things like the fraud risk that we'll need to attend to as we go forward. So the CIPFA statement also, remember this is normal times, the CIPFA statement also talks about the guidance in relation to section 114 notices. Onto the next slide. Seem to have lost control again. Apologies. Thank you. Got it back. So Appendix A of the statement talks about the key steps in a 114 process. There are three possible reasons for a 114 notice. One is about potential illegal payments. One is about not having sufficient resources to fund capital expenditure. But the third one, part 3 of section 114, talks about there being insufficient resources to fund likely expenditure. And whilst most often these deliberations happen at the time that council set in the budget, this is a permanent assessment that CFOs will need to be making as soon as it becomes apparent that there's insufficient resources to fund the likely level of expenditure. That's the point at which these sort of considerations need to come into play. And this hasn't been understood, I don't think, by government. What should happen, and normally this things happens over time, there's a build up to this, early considerations, early advice to the council about here's where we are, here's what we need to do to take remedial action, and be talking to the chief exec and the leadership team about what to do around this, and having informal discussions with internal external auditors about the mechanics of it. Appendix B, which is highlighted on the next slide, which is hopefully going to come up in a second. There's a flow chart which talks about the practical steps, and I think actually now during May and June, as Sarah mentioned, councils will be thinking about their first month and their first quarter financial monitoring and trying to project that forward. What you should be doing is talking to the chief executive leadership team, talking to the cabinet and auditors, putting in place prohibition of spending in order to balance the books, and reporting to council within 21 days. But frankly, that would be a disaster in the current climate, having to do that. These are extraordinary times, and I think an extraordinary approach is needed. Business as usual will not work. We are assuming at this stage that the government will not suspend the Section 151 responsibilities nor the statutory guidance. That's probably a sensible assumption to make. And also, we're also led to believe that borrowing for revenue from PWLB is unlikely to be available for councils. The Chancellor's borrowing £330 billion for other reasons. I'm pretty sure local government funding is probably not a reason he wants to borrow some more money for. So the problem, as both Sarah and Carolyn mentioned, is actually if a 114 notice was issued, the mitigating actions that would flow from it, i.e. spending controls, would firstly not be sufficient to balance the budget, and then, forgive the phrase, would kill the patient. They would damage the coronavirus response required by government for local authorities. So it wouldn't work, and it would do more harm than good. So of course the real solution is, as the LJ have been arguing for, as Carolyn articulated, as CIPFA have been arguing for, we need further significant, direct and speedy financial support to ensure we're not in that situation where the budget is unbalanced and there's a need to issue a 114 notice, which is about increasing the funding for councils to reflect these pressures and income losses rather than changing the rules. We might need to be more sophisticated in recognising the difference between additional direct COVID costs, income losses from council tax and business rates, which could be underwritten rather than funded by a grant, for example, some income losses will be gone forever, but some might well come back, providing the economy returns to normal. What CIPFA have been doing is talking to Treasury and MHCLG about potentially modifying the guidance around Section 114 to make sure that we recognise that the extraordinary situation that we are in. We haven't quite come to a conclusion on that, but we're still hopeful to be able to do that. The advice we've been giving to CFOs who ask us about this, the advice we're giving as CIPFA chimes with the sort of stuff people are no doubt seeing directly. MHCLG have asked that we refer councils to them first. So do not begin any spending prohibition until MHCLG have responded with their advice. So raise issues with them early. So Section 114 being a first resort rather than a last resort. MHCLG have said they are really keen and willing to listen and hear about the cases. Now you'll have seen in both the trade press and in the national press now talk of some councils either individually or collectively talking about the risk of issuing 114 notices. Some doing it by type of council, some doing it individual council. There was one at the weekend from, I think, the Yorkshire region talking about a regional approach. So I think people are raising the prospect of this. I think the confidence that will come from statements from government about we'll compensate you for these things, I think it will go a long way to giving councils the assurance that they need. But actually, if statements are made which actually damage that confidence or start to be less clear than they were at an early stage, I think we're going to be in a situation where relatively quickly more councils will be under the risk of the 114 pressure as a consequence of the challenges they're facing. I think the next data set that Sarah referred to before from the May returns, I think is going to be key to really understand the cost pressures, the income losses, to hopefully convince the Treasury about the real size and scale of these challenges. And I think the government's response to that in the next few weeks is going to be quite crucial. If councils can't get more confidence about support, I think we're in a situation where it's going to be much more likely that 114 notices would need to be issued. But of course, the downside of that is actually they wouldn't work and they would do more harm than good. So that's the conundrum of which we are facing. I think the more we talk to government, I think the more people get it, but I don't think enough people get it yet with the weight and the seriousness that maybe it warrants. And I know councils aren't the same as Transport for London, for example, but there was a bit of an irony that within, I don't know, a couple of hours of Sadiq Khan as the Mayor of London, if you like, threatening a 114 notice of Transport for London, that there was a bailout announced. I'm not quite sure we want to get to a situation where we are trying to sort of embarrass government into having to fund things to avoid things falling over. You would hope that a reasonably well-made case with good evidence is what's required. But there are people who are thinking about alternative ways of trying to make these cases. So CIPFA are still continuing to try and work with government to try and make sure that these issues are fully understood. I will stop there and look forward to anybody's questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. So we are just going to move on to got a few minutes left for a bit of question and discussion. So please do type your questions in. Someone's already asked if the slides will be available after the webinar. I think we'd be happy to make those available to anyone who is interested. Carolyn, can I go back to you and ask you about the returns to MHCLG, which you mentioned, and Sarah also mentioned. How do you think Section 1151 officers are going to be feeling taking a look at some of that data? How will they be feeling seeing some quite stark numbers there?
I think Section 151s will be feeling extremely concerned and anxious. I think, as has been mentioned in the presentations, the April return was very, very early doors. We were just newly into the crisis. We were absolutely firefighting at that point, and it was high-level guesstimates that we were trying to put together. by the time we've come to last Friday night's return, we've got a full month's experience under our belt. We're beginning to become more confident in understanding where the high levels of expenditure exposures are, and indeed beginning to understand what recovery might feel like as we come out of response. And certainly the numbers for my own council have grown quite significantly from the April return to the May return. One, because it's for a longer period. We've had instruction to include up until the end of July, and then make assessments on recovery as well. These are significant numbers, and as and unless there's an urgent response from government when they see those numbers cumulative across the country to get another raft of funding out to local government, then we'll be directly into Section 114 territory. Absolutely no doubt at all.
Andy, Sarah, do you have any follow-up on that? What's the sort of morale like? Have you picked up anything on how people are feeling?
I think that when there are obviously there are a lot of councils who are anxious, and I think there's nothing like putting it down on paper to kind of bring those anxieties home. We know we've been doing some case studies with a number of councils, and obviously talked to politicians and managers up and down the country, and there is a lot of worry. I think the biggest worries are coming not so much from the figures people are putting down, but from the change in the tone of the message that's come from central government. I think that is, in a sense, that's what's causing the anxiety. People were acting in good faith, doing what needed to be done. And I think, we just need to continue to keep at it and make the case. And one of the reasons why the LGA has decided to commission some independent analysis is just because of that, because it is independent, will be a trusted partner, and we hope that will help us make the case to central government. That certainty of one sort or another is needed, whether it's all a chunk of money that comes to councils, or at least that they set out what other measures councils could and should take. Even if we don't like them, if we know what they are, then at least that can be taken into account. So I think there's a lot hanging on these May returns. I'm really glad there's been a high response rate. There'll be work to do. You can't just take the number that turns out at the end because of the issue about assumptions. There were some common assumptions proposed, but I think some people may have changed those. So we'll have to have a look at that as the returns come back.
Okay.
Yeah, just to add, I think I'd agree with what Carolyn and Sarah had said, particularly that last point about the confidence coming from government messages and the importance of these returns from May. I guess the other thing to point out as well, there are some general issues for all councils, and there'll be some particular issues for certain councils who have particular features. So, for example, councils with airports, or councils with big arenas, or councils who rely quite a lot on income from tourism to fund the public service offer in their place. So there are some generic issues for most councils, but there are also some particular issues for particular councils. And I wonder whether at some point the government might start to move towards a generic response for all, but also some tailored responses for some, depending on their particular circumstances.
Thanks, Andy. We've had a question coming around liquidity concerns. Do you foresee any councils experiencing liquidity concerns ahead of any decision on relaxing borrowing rules for revenue purposes or more central support? Open to the panel. Who wants to jump in on that?
I don't mind having a go. I mean, certainly in the very early days of this, that was cash flow issues were going to be one of the key considerations. But the government, in fairness to them, responded very, very quickly, particularly with the business rate support arrangements, and actually gave councils money in advance of the new financial year starting. CIPFA surveyed CFOs in the early weeks of COVID and asked them about their biggest issues or concerns, and sort of cash flow and liquidity was a much smaller concern for most councils than the ongoing ability to balance the budget over particularly the 2021 year. So I'm not saying there aren't any cash flow or liquidity issues, but I think actually the main issue, I don't think, for most councils is about cash flow and liquidity for now. It's about actually the ability over the whole of the financial year on a proper accruals basis, how much income are you going to get to fund the level of expenditure that you are incurring, and that's not necessarily a cash flow issue in the first part of the year at least.
Okay.
I would agree with Andy. The government clearly finds it much easier to give us cash flow than hard cash.
I think so, and if individual councils or a group of councils came up with a cash flow issue, I think they'd probably find a way of resolving that, but it would be payback later. So, I think you're right. It's the reality of actual, shortfall of pounds at the end of the day that's the big problem.
You all gave some quite sort of, you didn't really pull your punches in sort of outlining the starkness of the financial position councils are confronting and the kind of change in mood music from central government and the anxiety that's causing. How realistic is it, do you think, that they'll start listening and come up with a solution that works for the sector? Are you confident that that's something that can be achieved?
I think Sarah here. So confident might be the wrong word. I think there's more we can do. I think the key is evidence, because although we've got the returns, they were, the very early returns were based on estimates. And as we get actuals, as Carolyn said, as they become more accurate based on actual things that are happening in the ledger, and as we gain understanding about the need to balance books and how it all works, I think the key is evidence that will convince the Treasury. I mean, obviously we've got our spending department, MHCLG, we've got all the social care pressures being outlined with DHSC, so there's work to do with them as well, definitely, and we've done some more work on social care costs too. So I think now is not the moment to despair. Now is the moment to knuckle down and start to really kind of make the evidence indisputable. I don't think we'll get 100%, of what we want, and actually there's no formula in the world that would deliver all the money to the places where all the gaps are in precise measure. So there will be some compromise to be made, but I think there's more to do to improve the evidence.
Yeah, Carolyn here. I'm going to be hopeful and optimistic. I think we must be until those hopes and optimism are dashed, and I'd like to avoid that. I do think it needs to come down to evidence, and I think now we have got strong evidence. And why would Section 151's complete forms on anything other than a strong evidence base? We have absolutely no reason to do so. And indeed, we know it would be wrong to do so. So I would like to think that they will be taken as being evidence of the reality of what we're dealing with. And I think it's fair to say across all of the Section 151 sectors, we're more than happy to give a commitment to assist MHCLG and Treasury to understand the numbers and understand the impact on the ground. So hopeful and optimistic.
Andy, you once told me you were an optimistic and hopeful person. Is that still the case?
Well, yeah. So I think if we take the sort of the four themes that I identified in my, I think, second or third slide, I think the additional costs, direct costs from following the guidance, I think yes, there'll be a making sure people haven't thrown the kitchen sink in and trying to recover from the austerity past that preceded this, but actually there will be evidence that we can gather about what the extra costs were for care or homelessness, and I think most of that, there's a realistic prospect of that being refunded by government. I also think potentially on council tax and business rates, there's a mechanism of underwriting the shortfall and comparing it with normal collection rates, which I think we can help the government understand better, and actually I think there's a reasonable prospect for us getting council tax and business rates underwritten in some way. I think it's harder, I think, for income from fees and charges and commercial activity to be, whilst it is an issue, absolutely, I think we might get less success there than in the other areas. So maybe partial support for that. And I think the one I have no confidence about at all is the inability to deliver on transformation and savings programs. The government will still be expecting, even though they haven't yet decided about the future funding of public finances. They've talked about no austerity, they've talked about major borrowing, they haven't yet talked about tax increases, but ultimately councils are going to need to continue to transform in different ways. And I think we're going to have to find alternative ways of delivering transformation savings that we're going to deliver through some other route. So I'm sort of optimistic about additional costs. I'm optimistic about council tax and business rates. I'm less optimistic about income from sales fees and charges. I'm not optimistic at all about transformation and efficiency savings being recognised.
Okay. We talked about the response from the sector and the sort of sector-wide advocacy, but thinking about individual local authorities, I mean, obviously, Carolyn, you're still very much at Section 151 officer. You're on the front line, as it were. What sort of tips pass on? What's the one thing people inside local authorities, whether Section 151 officer or the people supporting them in the finance team, what should they be doing? What should they be prioritising?
Within the finance sector, I mean, certainly prioritising the support that we can give to the real frontline services to make sure that we can help them to gather the evidence that we need to identify the expenditure. So everything we can do to take the burden off of frontline managers and staff to enable them to complete those returns.
Okay. Andy, would you concur with that as someone who...
I would, yeah, but with an eye on the future. I think tough as this might sound as a message, councils need to be thinking about next year's budget round and efficiency savings and transformation savings and doing things differently, notwithstanding the major challenges that we are going through. But as we come out of lockdown and start to move to whatever this new normal is going to become, the importance of those issues isn't going to go away. And I think a really important issue about the role of internal audit in particular and the counter-fraud arrangements. Go back and have a look at the decisions you made very quickly about key decision-making arrangements. Go back and look at fraud and counter-fraud measures. I think I'd be advising most councils to rip up their internal audit plan and start again. Because actually there's a real focus on making sure we don't lose the confidence that the public have in how well run and well managed most councils are. And if it looks like we are not managing this money well, I think there's more damage for us that might flow from that. So that's back to the credibility of the numbers issue could get damaged if it looks like councils actually paid money to people who didn't get it, no matter they did it for the best of reasons. I think we need to be really, really careful about not losing sight of the stewardship role that we have for public funds.
Okay, just one final one, I think, then before we wrap up. Perhaps it'd be interesting to get a review from all three of the panelists on this. Are there any? This has been quite a gloomy series of presentations in a way. Are there any silver linings to this situation? Do you think that there are some positives that will come out of the situation local authorities are currently in? I don't know who wants to have a go at that into the afternoon with a bit more of a spring in our step.
If I can be, on you go, Sarah. On you go.
Good, Sarah.
Yeah. So I don't know whether I think I am hopeful that the government will no longer be able to ignore adult social care as something that needs the resolution. There is a platform to build from, and we need to make sure we take the work we've done before and use this platform to get the solution that we need. And I know that there are many partners, the NHS, NHS Confederation, and all sorts of other players who are willing to support that, and we need to make that happen.
Carolyn?
I think, from an organisational perspective, I think what's been achieved during the crisis is absolutely remarkable across many different aspects of service provision. Those on the front line, absolutely without question, but those that are more in the enabling roles, the abilities for organisations to work in new, innovative and different ways. I think it does give an opportunity to look at the old ways of working and the potential for new and different ways of working that may well be transformational and may well save us significant sums of money. So I think there's an optimistic view there around the future as well.
Andy, final word to you.
And building on both of those, well, I think often coming out of a crisis, there's an opportunity to do things radical that otherwise wouldn't find that opportunity. So we should be rethinking and renewing and repositioning our arguments for a proper debate about the form and function of local government and its funding. Now, the best local leaders know that actually to improve outcomes, we need multi-agency integrated preventive approaches shaped around local needs and assets. And local government is by far a better place than anybody else to do that. You know, let local leaders determine what needs to go on in a local place, not throwing isolated pots of money from the centre at things and individual projects and programmes. So I think the local response, and I think we will prove this as well over the test, track and trace arrangements, which I think will show that a local approach to that will be much more successful than the so far failed central approach to it. So I think there is grounds for optimism, yes for social care, yes for transformation, but really for localism and showing that local can work better than national.
Thanks very much, Andy, and thank you all for tuning in this morning. I'm just going to wrap up the webinar here. So thanks again to our three speakers, Carolyn Williamson, Sarah Pickup and Andrew Burns. We will be making a recording of this webinar available, so if you missed part of it, or you'd like to review some of it, or you'd like to share the link with a colleague, you'll be able to do so. And we'll also be emailing out a link to the CIPFA statement on the role of the CFO. But once again, thank you all for tuning in, and thank you to our panelists.